Thank you very much, Isabel, for asking us to do this Delhi chapter, the India chapter of the democratizing work. The core committee has organized a number of workshops across many countries to discuss their specific experiences within the general framework of democratizing work, decommodifying labor, and protecting the environment. I located this particular workshop in Harsh's Center for Equity Studies. And thank you, Harsh, for being so cooperative in reaching out to various people. And we requested Renana and Anuradha to talk about their experiences in organizing women. And they've made quite a splash on the international scene as well, because Women for Work has become a very big agenda, what used to be global civil society. I think India is distinctive, largely because of its rural base, and mainly because 90% of our workforce belongs to the informal sector, probably more than 90. It's been calculated between 90 and 94. And but in the informal sector, trade unionism, of course, you require a certain number of people, a certain number of workers to be a member of a trade union. So that is one issue, the problem of unionizing informal workers, and particularly migrant workers who travel from place to place in search of work. There's going to be if the government manages to pass a bill saying they can vote from wherever they are, it will be a very big leap in the direction of empowering the workers to at least have some voice in the choosing of their government. The other problem is that because there are more workers and than jobs, when a vacancy falls, there is intense competition. So cooperation and solidarity between workers becomes a bit of an issue. The local governments don't seem to pay much heed to the surroundings in which they live, to providing them with adequate sanitation, drinking water, proper housing. And now in Delhi, of course, there's one part of Delhi that is being bulldozed because suddenly they realize these are unauthorized buildings and people are rendered homeless. So India is moving from crisis to crisis. We are lurching from crisis to crisis. After that very, very short introduction, and let me introduce Renana Jhabvala, who for long has been organizing women along with Ila Bhatt in Gujarat. And SEWA has become one of the major women's organizations across the world. Martha Nussbaum, whatever she talks about, starts off with SEWA. I mean, she starts off with how SEWA has empowered women to make their own decisions to acquire agency. So may I request Rena? We are waiting for Anuradha. I suppose she'll join at some point. But Renana, could you start, please? 20 minutes, 25 minutes, yeah?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this workshop. I would be talking really about women workers. My main experience, of course, is in India, but we have worked in other countries and we're closely in touch with women's organizations, women worker organizations in other countries. So first, the introduction. In most of the developing countries, women workers tend to be at the base of the pyramid. You know, we talk about a glass ceiling, but certainly in India, and I know in South Asia and in many parts of Africa, and even in some parts of East Asia, they don't have a glass ceiling. They have what we call a sticky floor. That is, they're never able to rise out of the base. What does that mean? It means, firstly, their work is often invisible, even when they're working for the economy. The care work, of course, is invisible, but even the work that they're actually doing for the economy is also invisible. To give you two examples, or maybe one example right now, many of our members are what we call home-based workers. That is, they make production of goods, often services, from inside their home. So they are entering the market, but the production is inside their home. Another example of invisibility, and I'm sure Anuradha will talk more about that, is of women farmers. That is, women who work on their own farm. They're not recognized as farmers. They're not recognized as workers at all. So they're all called, quote unquote, housewives. So invisibility is the first issue. The second issue, of course, I mean, there are lots of issues, but another issue is they have perhaps the lowest incomes. The kind of work they do tends to be the lowest paid, even when they're doing the same type of work as men. For example, in agriculture, they are paid less. They rarely own assets. So the land usually is in the man's name. When technology comes in, they get deprived. It goes into the hands of better educated men. And of course, they're at the bottom of the digital divide. And most of these workers are in what is called the informal economy. I'm not going to try and define it now, but worldwide, the ILO WIGO figures say that 60% of all women workers, that is worldwide, including the developed countries, is 60%. And in India, it's anywhere between 80 and 90%, depending on how you define it. Now, one thing I would like to point out is that these workers are not all wage workers. In India, at least, and certainly again in many developing countries, including sub-Saharan Africa, about 50% of the women are what is called self-employed. So 50% would be wage workers and 50% would be self-employed. I'll now move to SEWA. SEWA stands for Self-Employed Women's Association. Why did we call it Self-Employed Women's Association? Because it's actually a translation from the Indian term or the Hindi term, or we started with the Gujarati term, which is, I'll say it in our language, is Swashray Mahila Seva Sangh, which literally means by her own labor, Mahila women. Seva means being in service, and Sangh means solidarity. So we translated that into English as Self-Employed Women's Association. And Seva in India means being of service also. Now, Seva was formed 50 years ago as part of a very large trade union, which used to be very large at that time, no longer is. But SEWA was formed 50 years ago by our founder, who passed away late last year, called Ila Bhatt. And she was a trade unionist most of her life. And she formed SEWA because these women would be coming to her, women who were street vendors, women who were contract laborers, women who pulled carts. And they'd come to her and say, why can't we have a union of our own? And finally, they all came together and did form a trade union. So SEWA is a trade union of women in the informal economy. And that's the definition of the kind of work that the women do. It was formed with a small group. I think the first numbers were 200. And just as an aside to tell you that registering a trade union of women who didn't necessarily have a single employer, of women, workers who were not in one trade, but in many different occupations. And those who did not work under one factory roof was very difficult, and of only women. So we had a lot of trouble even registering the trade union, but finally we did manage. And today, SEWA is a national trade union. We have an annual membership, and our last membership, that is 2022, was 2.5 million women workers. We do also have men workers, but they're associated men workers, associate members. So we are not counting those. And very early on, what we learned was that just organizing for rights is really not enough, because there were no laws, because they were practically invisible. So very early on, we adopted two strategies. One was, of course, the trade union strategy of organizing for our rights. And the second was and bargaining for rights. And the second strategy was to come together to enter the market. And we would do that in the form of cooperatives, and thereby bypassing a number of different layers and sort of moving up the pyramid. I'll just talk very briefly about both those strategies. Firstly, the bargaining. Now, in most trade unions, there's bargaining with an employer. In the informal economy, there's no one employer always. There are many contractors, or say a domestic worker, for example, she may work for 4 employers. Bargaining with 4 employers, or they may be a big employer who employs a contractor, who employs a subcontractor, and then who employs this woman. So bargaining is often with contractors or a class of employers. So you can't, it's often, you ask your own employer, a domestic worker, again, would talk to her own employer, but unless all the employers were raising the wages, it would become difficult. And the other type of worker, who is the self-employed worker, and an example of that, a very good example of that, is a street vendor. They don't have an employer to bargain with. So who do they bargain with? And in the case of, say, street vendors, or even construction workers, or even waste collectors, or different types of artisans, they need to bargain with the state, with some state actor. So just to take an example, the street vendors. So our laws, which come down from the British Poor Laws, actually, state that you cannot sell anything on the street unless you have a license. And then most cities will not give their street vendors licenses. So most street vendors in India, and there are about, the last we estimated, were 10 million or so. The number, all those street vendors are quote unquote illegal, and therefore picked up by the police and driven away by the municipality, and are treated like criminals. Who do they bargain with? They bargain with the municipalities, the cities, and they bargain with the police. They also often have to bargain with residential colonies. And to strengthen bargaining, a lot of times we as a union need to actually change policies and change laws. And in the street vendors case, we, over many, many, many years, we have won cases in the courts, and we have also gotten law which is supposed to protect the street vendors. Unfortunately, as people who come from India know, those laws which are pro-worker are often not implemented. So that's one example of the kind of bargaining that we need to do. I also talked about domestic workers. We don't have minimum wages for them, or we did not have. Now some of the Indian states do have minimum wages for domestic workers. But again, we had to lobby, we had to, have rallies and so on in order to get any kind of policy for domestic workers, even recognition for domestic workers. For the women, people who are self-employed and are not only self-employed, but when we want to enter the market directly, excuse me a minute. When we want to enter the market directly, we help the women to form cooperatives, which means that they need to be thinking much more like a joint entrepreneur. And there they need capital. And what we are finding is there are very few sources of capital for these kind of self-employed. There are sources of capital for much, much bigger entrepreneurs, but not for them. And secondly, there are reaching the markets is very difficult for them, partly because they're women and there's so much care work, partly because they're women and the whole culture does not allow them to go out as much, and partly because they do not have the knowledge on how to reach the market. So there are all these issues which, as an organization, as a trade union, as an organization, we continually have to solve. I will be ending soon. I want to tell you what we aim for is visibility for these women workers, for women workers in the informal economy, both rural and urban. I wanted to talk a little bit about women farmers, for example, and I know Anuradha will do much more on that. But as I said, even in the statistics that are collected, there's we hear that in India, the women's labor force participation is very low, but a lot of women workers, they're just never collected. And partly because they themselves, there's the inner consciousness is not there of a worker. So a woman can be on her own farm, her own tiny farm for 8 hours a day. But if she's asked, what work do you do? She said, oh, I only work in my home. So, so visibility is very important. Secondly, voice. So women representing themselves at the local levels, very important, at the national and also the international level. And finally, viability, the 3 V's, visibility, voice, and viability. That is, whatever gains you get need to be sustainable, whether it is as a cooperative so that you become viable, or it is as your bargaining power, so that whatever gains you get then remain. So you're always fighting for them to remain. And finally, this can only happen through organizing. So organizing means bringing the women workers together, which means you have to spend a lot of time in building awareness, because as I said, women workers often don't think of themselves as workers. So building an inner awareness that you contribute, we contribute to the economy, and we need to recognize that we contribute to the economy. And more important, or equally important, is solidarity, so that nobody is undermining each other, and building solidarity across caste groups, across religious groups, which has become more and more difficult because of the kind of forces that have arisen in India. And when we build this kind of solidarity, I think the main thing that is required is the local leaders. There's a very famous quote, well, it's not famous because I've never seen it again, but of Chairman Mao, who said that in every village and every urban community, there are people who have a desire to lead, who have an inner fire to service the community. And one needs to recognize that and find them and then develop them. And that is what I think is really the basis of solidarity and building an organization. We call them Agavans, that is those who go ahead. And we usually, they are the elected leaders. So whether they're elected, say, to the board of a cooperative or they're elected to the union, they're the ones that local people, local women recognize and trust. And the Agavans are where we really invest in building, because they don't have much education. So in building their confidence, in building their articulation, in building their understanding, and helping them to represent their people, their women or their community at different levels. And the Agavans are the real heroes or heroines. We just, as one example, during the COVID crisis, when you couldn't travel, you couldn't go out, it was the Agavans who went from house to house and who really helped all the local people to get food, to get work, and kept them encouraged. And there was nobody else who could do that. So I think what we really need to do is spend all our efforts and investment in building up the local leaders from the occupations, from the communities. And that's what's really going to change the way things are. Thank you. I think I've done my 20 minutes.
Thank you, Renana. That was amazing. You know, and I think Isabel would be interested, because Isabel, you have been talking about how workers should be represented at the topmost levels of decision making. And here you see an alternative system of representation where an association elects leaders who are in touch with the grassroots. And I may tell you that as a student of social associations, one of our problems has been the very top-heavy nature of the association. You know, one person leads and the absence of democracy. So it's a great, great endeavor. More power to your association. We continue to be admirers. Thank you. Anuradha, welcome. We look forward to listening to you. Anuradha is well known for her work in mobilizing rural women. And you have slides, right?
I have slides, and I'm extremely sorry to be rushing.
No, that's all right, to be realized.
So, yeah, so I'll just, firstly, hello to everybody. And I'll start with slides because I'm not very good at talking without stuff to look at. So I'll use slides. And I think a lot of it will be what Renana has already said, because I think we work with SEWA in West Bengal also. So I think there's a lot of overlap in what we do. So I think I'll be echoing some of the same things. So this is, I have to go to share screen, right? Yeah, can you see this stuff now? Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, great. Is it still visible? Are the slides, is it visible as slide? Okay, fine. I'll start. Huh? So obviously we were asked, I want to talk about democratizing of women's work. And as Neera has already said, my experience is basically with rural workers. I work with the Rural Workers Union in West Bengal. And we have also started organizing tea garden workers. So I'm going to basically talk about my experience from there. Now, I read whatever little I could read. I read about democratizing work, decommodifying labor, decarbonizing the economy. And when I looked at our own work, I thought it was just, trying to get people to survive with some dignity. There was, the actual reality on the ground is so harsh for the people we work with that the whole idea of participating in work and in work decisions, or decarbonizing the economy, decommodifying labor, these are very distant thoughts for the people we work with. But I'm sure that, when I was looking at things a bit more closely, some of these effects are happening, but our strategy is basically one for survival, where we try and help the workers we work with to kind of, and the women in our organization, to actually be able to just, sort of improve their standards of living to some small extent. One of the big struggles for us, I'll just talk about the few important things that have happened in our work. So as an agricultural workers union, one of the first things we started off with was the demand for work, because unemployment was a huge issue for rural workers. And this started almost since the inception of our union, which was in somewhere in 1987. So right from the inception, we started demanding work and a law to guarantee work. And we were quite, this campaign picked up a lot. And finally, we were able to get an act passed, which now guarantees 100 days of work for all rural workers or anybody who demands work in a rural area. So this has been very positive in many senses, especially for women. And women have started participating in huge numbers in these schemes. So firstly, what we found is, now if you look at NREG today, it's basically 60-70%, in some states even 80-90% women who participate in NREG. And in West Bengal, where we have one of the lowest female work participation rates in paid work in the country, it was responsible for bringing women out and into the job market. So from that point of view, it had a very positive impact. And it also, the whole concept of equal wages, which was quite alien to what was happening in rural areas earlier. There's more of an acceptance. I wouldn't say there are equal wages in all districts, all places, but in many places, especially where there is not such a dearth of work employment opportunities, where it's not totally very, very drastically poor, equal wages has become quite common. And it's accepted that women should get equal wages to men. Similarly, in the beginning, in the heyday years, we also had this impact, very good impact on migration, where in many places where especially the men stopped migrating. In Purulia, where we have our union is very strong, we found that was happening. And there are a number of case studies and a number of which have been done even by the government of India, where it shows how it can be used very effectively for environmental protection. During COVID, it had an extremely important impact and was a kind of a lifeline for many people, especially for many workers who lost work in urban areas and came back to rural areas. And there was also this potential for decentralization. The law said it should be decentralized. So there was this element of people being able to control their own work situation, which didn't work very well, but this was the kind of potential there was in this law. Now, at the present moment, and the most important thing for us was that it brought women out into public spaces, and it made it possible to organize and unionize women in rural areas, or unionize workers, because otherwise in rural areas in India, there are absolutely practically no laws for women, for workers around which you can organize. So this became a very good way of organizing agricultural workers. And in fact, because of NREGA, in a number of states, unions have come up, small and big unions, which are working with agricultural workers or rural labor now, which was not there, say, when before this act was there, maybe 30, 40 years ago. It was a very small proportion of the workers were organized into unions in rural areas. It could have been, there could have been peasant organizations or farmers organizations, but workers organizations were very few. Now, and so for example, if you look at this picture, it's a very interesting picture. You have, these are women from Haryana who are actually, if you see the way in which they covered their faces, Haryana has this tradition of women, being covering their faces and being in parda in a way, in veiling their faces. But here you have the Manrega Mazdoor Union, which is what those big posters say. And these are women who are going out to work despite that veil on their face, and who are actually involved in organizing and in actually articulating their demands. So that is the kind of impact it's had on women, in rural women who were earlier many of them confined to the house. But now what we are having now is, at the moment especially, we're having a backlash. And for the past some years, the government has been trying to kind of, bury Manrega as we call it, bury NREG, and to kind of kill it. And this budget, we've had a 33% cut in the budget. So there's been a huge kind of cutback in the amount of money that will be available. There's been a delay in wage payments, and this is a constant thing that people don't. They're supposed to get wages within 15 days. People don't get wages for months and months and months. So obviously, people who are very poor workers lose interest in this whole thing. And now what we have is in West Bengal now, right now, the state which are in, on the issue of, on the pretext of corruption, the central government has stopped giving us money for the last 1 or 2 years, 1 year, more than a year. And this is despite the fact that by law, they are mandated to give us work. They have to give us work and they have to give us money. Despite that, the central government is not doing that. So it's become from a scheme which was kind of demand driven, it's become a top-down scheme where the central government or the state machinery decides what work is to be done, where is to be done, instead of people demanding work and getting it. And this whole, there are a lot of technological issues, of various technologies being used, which the poor cannot use, and which because of the internet and stuff like that, they're not able to use. And this is despite the fact that during COVID, it was considered to be such a good scheme and such a, it was, praised all over the world as being something which was sustaining the poor. Despite, and though the COVID aftermath is still there, they have just kind of just left this scheme. And now, so right now we are in the middle of a dharna, a sit-in protest, which is in Delhi, where which we have declared is going to be for 100 days, for 100 days of work, which is what the scheme guarantees, by 100 people every day. So it's like all the kinds of hundreds that we can use, we've used as symbology as possible in this whole thing. And this dharna is going on right now. So these are some of the pictures of women protesting in this dharna. This is not from the dharna. This is from an earlier protest from our women. And this is the dharna. This is started just day before, and this is going to go on for the next 100 days because we are very concerned about the fact that this money is being cut back, new technology is being introduced, and we are probably going to lose this scheme. The scheme is gradually going. So this is one of the struggles that we have been in, which is kind of to establish at least some kind of survival strategy for women workers. The other thing which has been a major concern for us is on leadership in unions and in society. So traditionally, unions in India, besides SEWA of course is an all-women's union. Traditionally, leadership in unions in India has been in the hands of men, which is, I think, is true everywhere. It's not just something which is special to India. And this has been a struggle for us to get women into leadership positions. So when we started our union, which is called PBKMS, Paschim Bango Khet Mazdoor Samiti, West Bengal Agricultural Workers Union, in 1987. From 1987 to 1990, there were very few women in the leadership. And it was basically a male-dominated union where women's concerns were not being expressed. After a great deal of debate within the union, we managed to form the Shramajivi Mahila Samiti, which is the working women's organization, where women kind of organize together. So as a result, this is from 1990 to today, the mobilization of women in our movement has increased. In the Agricultural Workers Union, it has increased. And there are also women are becoming leaders. Women have become leaders in a movement where both men and women are there. So, and this, I think, I would consider it one of the successes of our work. And it's also got to do with the impact of feminization of the agricultural work, because men are leaving agricultural work. And it's more and more women who are taking over this work. So that is also one of the reasons, because villages are empty now. There are no men there. Men have migrated to better occupations, to cities, etc., etc. So the women have to hold the fort in the family and in the village. So this is what is happening. This is so, and so women have taken up various struggles, which are, there's an anti-liquor struggle, also to stop domestic violence. They have various activities. If you look at this picture is of women with brooms, because we did a demonstration saying that we were in Bangla saying Maud Jua Khor, GTA Vidai Kor. That is basically we're trying to get rid of drinking, gambling, drugs, and we're going to use our brooms to sweep them out of the village. This was a kind of a demonstration we had, and this is symbolic of the very strong reaction that women have to liquor and to the fact that it causes violence in their villages. And it's one of the ways in which they organize. I mean, it's outside of work, but it has an impact on their organizing for work also, because these kinds of issues are also very important for women. This is a similar picture of the same demonstration. The other thing that I think has been very important for us to get women into leadership positions, besides the fact that we take up issues which are so-called social issues, is the fact that we ourselves have lived in a collective. So, for example, if you look at this woman, she's one of the collective members. We both joined the union together. And because we live in a collective, we were able to look after child rearing, cooking, all those kinds of things, which would have otherwise, as young women, we would have got stuck in it and we would have not been able to do organizing. We were able to do organizing because of that. Because our children were taken care of, our food and everything was taken care of by the collective. So we were free to move around. So we managed to build up a very strong women's leadership in the union because of this, because we were able to support women in these ways. And I'm again saying this because I was just trying, what I'm trying to emphasize is that if we want women in leadership positions in unions or in movements, these kinds of things, whether it's the family, domestic violence, or liquor, or childcare, all these issues have to be looked at and looked after. So this is part of democratizing work as such. So, okay, and then I'm just going to very briefly talk about our unions in tea gardens. Tea gardens are kind of famous for, just a 60-70% women force in the tea gardens and 100% leadership, which is male. I've had the experience of being the only woman in a room full of men when they were with 150, 200 men, where negotiations for wages were going on. And I was obviously shut up. I had very little voice there. Other women have very little voice there. So this is one thing we're doing, is developing leadership amongst these women also. So I'm just going to talk about a garden called Dimdima. This is a picture from Dimdima, which very recently what the women did there was, there's also a lot of resentment against party-led unions because they're very corrupt in the tea gardens. So these women from this particular garden, they threw out all the unions. They threw out all the men's unions and they formed an all-women's committee of 72 women. And the committee was of 72 women, and all the women and men in the garden have supported them. And this is one experience where women's leadership has asserted itself. This is very new for us because we're not very old in the tea gardens and organizing. But this is something that we're trying to do, of helping women to come into leadership positions. And we find the men at least the men who join our union are quite supportive of this also. So this is a similar picture of the same garden where women are negotiating with the manager. They've presented the charter of demand. This would also be a very strange situation where the men are in the background and the women are actually talking to the manager. And in this particular garden, the manager has accepted the union and he talks to the women for all demands before he does anything, he takes any action. And also again, in a similar thing about work in the gardens is that these are gardens which are closed, abandoned, where there are huge dues owed to the workers there. And so we're fighting for these dues and we've gone to court on that. We've done struggles on the ground. And this is, it's like basically trying to get just wages for people and the kind of dues that they should get legally, like gratuity and provident fund, pension. These are all kind of proper wages, maternity benefit. All these things are in the law, but the tea gardens many of the tea gardens are refusing to give it. So we've been in a long struggle for this. Recently, we got a Supreme Court order where I 650 crores now. How much sorry, I won't be able to convert it into other kind of things. So that kind of money was given to them to, for one state in Assam. And we're fighting this case in 3 or 4 states where there are tea gardens. This is some of the pictures of women in the tea gardens. So just to give an idea of what kind of work that they do and what kind of this thing they are part of. The next thing I would just like to talk about is women's work in families. Now, I think Renana has already talked about it. Women do not think that they work. especially in rural areas, women are majorly in housework, and this is unpaid work. And like, for example, if you look at it here, this particular unpaid work, sort of 44% of this is from a study that we have done. 44% women said that they were working 12 to 16 hours a day on housework. And this is all unpaid work. But this is work which is very essential, especially in a rural area, because family labor is essential for any small peasant or marginal peasant family to survive. They will not be able to survive without these women working. And that's true of small businesses also, hawkers and things like that, people who make, sort of food on the street and all that. Many of them have their wives supporting them. But neither the women nor their families acknowledge this as work, this is something that is a struggle for us to, I think Renana has also talked about it, to get women to understand, to get all of us to understand this is work and this is essential, and it has to be done. It has to be recognized as work. And part of this is, like, for example, in the Food Security Act, there's another law that all of us work together, including Harsh, to get it passed. We had asked for maternity benefits there for women, for all women in India, and that is now in place, so it doesn't function all that well. So all women in India are recognized, whether it's formal sector, informal sector, everybody is recognized that they are eligible to get maternity benefit. This is basically a recognition of her role as a woman in society. And, it's not just money, it's also a very important recognition that she has a role to play as a person who's reproductive. So these are again some pictures of women in our union with their children, and part of this struggling with their children and trying to get their demands fulfilled, where the children also are, it's an essential part of whatever they're doing. So in the end, what I would just like to say is that if we talk about democratizing work, we cannot just talk about the workplace as far as women are concerned. We have to talk about the family. We have to talk about the workplace. We have to talk about society in general. We have to talk about the organizations that we work in. How internally are we able to give room to women workers within those organizations? And so whatever we have to do has to be multifaceted, on multiple fronts. And it's basically a way of actually democratizing society, not just democratizing work, but democratizing society, because women and work cannot exist without their roles in society, without their roles in family. All this has to be done together. It cannot be isolation. We just cannot consider women as workers alone. We have to consider their entire lives, and then we have to decide on how we work with them. That's all I have to say. Thank you. I hope I finished in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. I think what was very interesting before I ask Harsh to intervene, and I'll make my concluding comments after Harsh, and then we can open the discussions for general questions. There are 2 or 3 issues that came up very strongly in both presentations, and both presentations were just excellent. It's so lovely to hear about radicalization of social relations in the middle of idiotic things like tax raids on the BBC and all kinds of censorship going on. One was solidarity. Renana mentioned it, but Anuradha also mentioned it, and the fact that when women do demonstrate or mobilize for better conditions of life, there are other women looking after their families, small children, etc. And solidarity is, I think, a value that needs to be brought center stage. We were having a friendly discussion the other day, Harsh and I and a couple of other people, whether we should replace fraternity with solidarity, because fraternity is a gender-specific term and solidarity is not. But, that is a different story. The second is, it struck me how much, mobilization, political mobilization depends upon the government protecting the right to association. And we live in a regime where associations are practically frowned upon, and either they impose particular sections of the law, or to prevent associational life, to prevent people from getting together, or just police harassing everyone, putting them in jail. In a way, when the state fails to protect people or provide the basic conditions within which people can make their lives the way they want to, along with others, the only alternative is mobilization, unless you want people to go out on the streets and storm the centers of power. And mobilization itself depends upon the recognition that you cannot do anything against a democratic state unless you have the right to association and freedom of expression and, of course, solidarity. Many of us who are involved in projects of rethinking democracy feel that the one value that we have not laid enough stress on is solidarity, is fraternity. So we focused upon liberty, we focused upon equality, but both of them have, I'm afraid, resulted in the creation of very individualistic societies and just focusing on the relationship between the state and the individual. But what about the relationship of individuals to other individuals, citizens to others, your co-citizens, your fellow citizens? I mean, in the 1990s, we were speaking of global justice. You know, we reacted to the American formulation saying we owe you, and we said, guys, you're a part of the white man's burden. But in a way, this notion of cosmopolitanism that we owe people who are not a part of our fellow citizens, but who belong to countries, in a way was widening of horizons. And now, unfortunately, but I'll talk about that later, about populism and the closing in of minds. This complex of rights, and both these experiments in organizing women have recognized that rights are independent, are interdependent. And finally, you see, what is happening to Narega is very scary, because not only is it preventing the demand for a generic right to work, it is being replaced by what is called, in East Asian countries, benevolent despotism. That you give a handful of rice to people, and they're lavishly photographed. Those bags of rice or that bags of wheat have the photograph of the leader on it. Now, they completely forget that the right to subsistence is a basic right of citizens, because you vote for people and give them also power so that they can provide you with the basic conditions which are needed to live a life of dignity. Now, so personalized good, you know, we don't call them social rights because they are not paralleled by mobilization in civil society. Civil society is being suppressed all over the world, wherever you have populist regimes. But you're granting social goods, you give a handful of rice and take away your civil liberties. And that is a very, very worrying trade-off, which used to be reminiscent of East Asian benevolent despotism. So this grant and then tom-tomming that the leader has not left anybody unfed, has handed over rice, it's so derogatory, it's so humiliating, you know, it completely takes away the dignity of the citizen in a democracy, because it is no longer a rights-based discourse. Therefore, it's a textbookish thing to say, but there's a big difference between social goods and social rights. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore provided his people with social goods. He did not provide them with the right to freedom of expression. So in a way, that interdependence of rights. But for that, I'm going to ask Harsh to talk about his experiences as members of an advisory group in the previous government that actually enunciated a complex of rights. And the other right, which is very important in women mobilization, the right to elementary education, which was also legislated by the NAC. Harsh, please.
Thank you so much, Neera, and thank you, Renana and Anuradha. I think the wonderful presentations. Your work is, so inspiring, and I even though I know your work so closely, I both learned and felt proud to listen to you. So thank you both. And Neera, your very thoughtful comments. There is little for me to add in this panel, but I did think that I needed to sort of talk about one thing before I talk about the social rights framework that we were able to help bring in through the last regime. And that is that, we're talking about women and work, but what I wanted to underline was that the context of work in general, and particularly of workers' rights, is overall, dismal in India, especially in the recent decades of neoliberalism. So that's just so that we understand. So we're living in a context in which informal labor is the mainstay of the economy. Something like 9 out of 10 workers are informal workers, 9 out of 10. And informal workers contribute at least about 50% of the gross national product. Yet, this labor is mostly outside any positive regulative role of the state. They are mostly undocumented, have effectively little or no labor rights. And the rights that they had fought for over the earlier decades of our freedom have got progressively dismantled, including the right of association in neoliberal times. Economist Barbara Harris-White speaks actually of a war. It says that there's an unstated war on informal workers by the state, and its main instrument is deliberate policy in action. Now, one part of it, which I thought we need to talk about, is the extraordinary context of jobless growth, and I don't think we are, we're mindful enough. So there was a growth model that came in with neoliberalism, and I think it made, it made certain promises. Most of all, that when big business comes in, it competitively provisions even public goods like healthcare and education. How do you care if some people get super rich? Everybody will be better off, much better off, because this will produce huge numbers of jobs. And in the end, if you have better employment, better wages, you will buy in the market the best kind of healthcare and education and pensions and whatever. That was, I think, what was promised 30 years ago. And we have to confront the fact that this central problem, huge wealth was created, but very unequally. But this is a period of almost jobless growth, and particularly jobless when you look at decent work opportunities. And even in the high noon of India's economic growth, a decade earlier, from 2004 to 2010, for instance, 55 million people joined the workforce, but only 2.7 million jobs were added in this period. Now, please understand that this is a net addition, but the story is actually even more dismal, because we're talking about net addition to jobs, but formal jobs, formal decent work employment was reduced even more drastically in this period. And what we really saw was an accretion of the few jobs that were added were mostly of low quality, low-end jobs without job security. Whereas decent work, what ILO calls decent work opportunities, actually declined, and declined significantly during this period. Wages were almost stagnant. So I think that this is something that we need to, and so we're seeing much more of completely casual work, 93% of casual workers had no written job contracts at all. And even 68.4% contract workers did not have any job contract. So even among the supposedly more formal wage salary employees, about 66% of employees are reported to be working without a written job contract. And there's a stagnation in the growth in worker salaries as well. The next, so the vast majority of jobs are created in recent years have been in the informal sector in the absence of a legal framework for labor protection and social security. It took decades of labor struggles to reach a point until the early 90s where there was some degree of labor law protection. A weak regime of labor rights, and even more weakly enforced. But what we're seeing now is even this very, very weak framework of labor rights, including the right to organize, has become weaker and weaker. Next brief point I want to talk about, when we talk about informal labor, we also miss the entire diversity of this frame. And Renana spoke, for instance, about home-based workers. And we've been looking at home-based workers who wouldn't even, they literally spend, across slums in all our cities. If you really go in, you'll find women with their children, sometimes with older people, spend hours and hours. The factory floor has, in a sense, been broken up into tiny tasks, and you don't know what you're contributing to. And they work, you might be just turning socks the other way around, or you're putting a little clip somewhere or something. And women were literally earning, and you'd find it difficult to believe, something equivalent to about $1 or $2 a day, with the whole family working. And they're not even recognized as workers. Even they themselves say, no, we are just we're just, they're embarrassed about this. And then Anuradha talked about the farm workers, more and more feminized. Then we have, there's a casual daily wage worker every day looking for work. And in cities, you find these labor chalks. These are, where they gather every morning, almost like reminiscent of slave, slave being, presenting their bodies, and anyone coming and bidding and taking them away. We have circular migrants, people who spend 8 to 9 to 10 months, and what Jan Bremen calls the hunters and gatherers of work, often to brick kilns. Most brick kilns have circular migrants. Nearly, in many ways, they're like bonded labor. You get an advance, and you paid absolute subsistence, and you will not be able to leave because you don't get your salary, your earnings till the end. Then there's domestic workers, there are street vendors, which we spoke about. More settled migrant workers are in small and small and medium enterprises. Then there's settled contract workers in manufacturing and services, but they still contract. And then there are contract workers even within the formal sector. So I just felt I wanted to emphasize this. One thing that hit us particularly hard, during the pandemic, when our Prime Minister announces with 4 hours notice that the entire economy is going to be shut down, and he's asking people to stay at home and work from home. And I kept thinking that, doesn't he remember that 9 out of 10 workers are informal workers who will not be able to eat tomorrow if they don't earn? And you don't have a plan for them. You're allowed to ask to keep social distance. 6 out of 10 people in India live in one room or less. How are you going to keep social distance? You're told to wash your hands regularly. How are you going to? And a few of us went to the Supreme Court demanding that that if people in the formal sector are getting their wages for sitting at home, it is rightful that every informal worker gets the equivalent of minimum wages during the lockdown. It was sort of bitterly opposed by the government, and we finally couldn't get orders on this. But you know, leading economists Prabhat Patnaik and Jayati Ghosh and I also wrote about a series of op-eds making this demand. But when we were sitting together, we were saying that assume that if the government had decided in rural areas because of NREG, and I'll end with talking about that, at least you have a listing of workers today. In urban areas, you don't have any documentation. So assume that the state had decided to give the equivalent of minimum wages to workers. It doesn't know who the workers are. It doesn't know what their names are. It doesn't know their numbers. It has decided, I mean, so we have a hugely, heavily undocumented workforce. And employers are motivated to underreport the number of workers they employ because they have an adverse incentive. Because if you record them, then you have to provide them some services under law. So I don't record them at all. It escapes them duties, costs, etc. And impoverished and poorly lettered workers find it very difficult to demand this. And there's therefore even less opportunity for unionization and collectivization. And this means all workers, and then when you think about women workers, all informal workers are almost invisible to the state. The government does not know they exist. It doesn't know their numbers. It doesn't know who they are. Therefore, they're unable to claim any kind of insurance benefits, maternity benefits, housing, and provisions under various laws. And I'll end with how extraordinary, even limited, but still extraordinary was, everybody's spoken about the Mahatma Gandhi NREGA. This was a demand that, if I'm without work, I'm not demanding that you give me just a dole. I'm demanding work. And I want a guarantee of work. And it's an extraordinarily powerful idea with a huge amount of negotiation. And please remember that this was during neoliberal times, but we still had an attempt to create a series of rights, including the right to food, the right to education, the right to information, and a limited right to work. So how it operates is that under the law now, if I'm a person in a village, I demand work. It is the duty under law of the state to ensure that I get work within 15 days, within 5 kilometers of where I live. And I have to get at least 100 days of work per household. It's less than what we had demanded, but it is still extremely significant. And if India was saved from a huge catastrophe of even greater than we saw during the lockdown, it was because we had the Food Security Act on the one hand and the employment guarantee, this limited employment guarantee. But we, in operation, and Anuradha talked about the agitations and the dharna, that is the sit-in that is sitting now. The government has never really treated it as a gag. The law demands that it has to be demand-led. You demand it and you have to provision resources. But in practice, it is still budget-led. And in the latest budget, they have reduced by one-third, even though the economy is going through this ongoing crisis post-lockdown. So it is limited by the amount of budget you can provide. And so it does not work even in reality as a guarantee, although the law envisaged it as something that it's demanded. You have to give it. And women have benefited far more from NREGA. It's really, when you go into an NREGA site, it's substantially women. And you have childcare facilities, you have water facilities, you have a safe place of work. And that was it. And I believe that not only, I mean, this is something that, it's somewhat Keynesian. It's something like what happened during the Great Depression in the United States. We have a kind of guarantee to create conditions of work. I think the time has also come for an urban employment guarantee. And that has to be much more creatively imagined. And we've done a lot of thinking about it. And I believe that the an urban job guarantee will have to have a much greater component of the care economy, of care services for disabled people, for older people, etc., which are recognized as work, and for which there's a guarantee of the kind that we've seen partially in the countryside. But today, women are struggling for work in a condition where there is literally very few opportunities. There's a rapidly declining opportunities for decent protected work, where there is virtually jobless growth, and very little protections and for them. And in such a situation, it needs a radical new imagination for our economy and for the idea of rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh. So the only thing I want to add is that we have a very peculiar phenomena going on in India today, and that is, to give an example, work has been done on the way Tatas in Jamshedpur. The Tatas is a big industrial family, and they have done a lot for India, probably more than any other capitalist. They had instituted, along with the Nehru government, the 50s government, a system in which every worker, and they were mainly male, would be promised that his eldest son would get a job, would get a permanent job. Now, what is happening is that formal jobs are becoming contractual. So studies have been done to show that the father is getting a pension, but the son is in a contractual position, very insecure, very highly contingent, and with the result that there is tension between families. So we are seeing within the formal wage working sector, we are also have the informalization of labor. This is happening particularly in the university, where permanent jobs are being replaced by guest lecturers, and I don't see how education can ever develop when people are there for 2 months or 3 months without provident fund, without any payment for holidays, etc. And I think, Harsh, I don't think they don't know that so much unemployment is around or people are being underemployed. I think having a pool of people who are in constant search of some kind of money serves them. Because if you see the first model in Telangana, KCR, why is he so popular? And a friend of mine, they all were radical, asking for work, asking for rights for Dalit. She said, what is he doing? He's just giving away money. And that has happening increasingly with every government. Governments, okay, you vote for us, we'll give women 200 rupees or 2,000 rupees. They forget the essential Marxist dictum that you actually, for dignity, you need work. You don't need to be just paid a little money. Though I know this has become a big debate across the world, I still feel that government, this is a lazy form of looking after your people, just handing out money. You make jobs because you don't add to anybody's dignity by not giving them jobs. Right. The presentations are open for discussion. If anybody wants to make intervention. Isabel, would you like to start? I'll mute myself. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Neera. Well, thank you, everyone, for such a thoughtful workshop. I guess, there are many questions I would love to ask, and I will not raise questions to Harsh and Neera, although there were so many crucial points that you made and that need more engagement with. But I wanted to hear more from Renana and Anuradha, maybe first by asking the following question in terms of the learning points for other workers on the planet. That's one of the interesting feature of this workshop is that we are looking together at situations that seem to be very different, but actually there are reasons to think that we have important learning points, even though the situations look different. And when I was hearing from Renana, I immediately thought of the situations of platform workers in the West, Uber workers, workers who are working in the so-called, digital economy via some gig platform, or have more than one employer through those platforms. What would be, from your perspective, when you look at their situation, what are key learning points that you can make from your experience in terms of organizing informal workers in India? And to Anuradha, I would love to hear more about the strategies for democratizing the union leadership that you put in place. This is also a big challenge everywhere, actually on the face of the planet, but also certainly in countries like in some Western countries, in Europe in particular, where we still have strong unions. The leadership is not very female, while in some industries, workers are mostly female workers. So can you help us understand how you went for making that possible to balance the leadership, and to eventually, as I understand, get more and more women workers become union leaders? Thank you very much.
Nana, would you like to begin answering, and then I'll ask Anuradha?
Okay, we'll go one by one. I think what you were talking about, platform workers, we call gig workers here. They exist also now, have come up in large numbers in India. You mentioned Uber. We have Uber. We have our own Ola, which is an Indian Uber. And then we have many types of other workers. For women, there aren't that many gig workers, but beauty workers now are coming up as gig workers. Domestic workers, not so much. Often nursing is also emerging. So I think, what I said earlier, that organizing is always the key. The question is the how of organizing. And I'll just say 2 or 3 things, because organizing techniques vary from place to place. One is that, nothing beats having meetings, physical face-to-face meetings. So nothing beats that. That's sort of the first important thing. Also, you do need organizers who will go from place to place. And often organizers can come from the community themselves. But now, with all these different digital means, even for our own workers in SEWA, the informal workers who were not that used to smartphones or not that educated, even they, we find, are we reach through digital means. Through WhatsApp groups are very, very popular, and they form very quickly. So, and for gig workers, of course, their whole life is digital. So to reach out to them digitally, I think that's a very important way of organizing for the gig workers. The other main point I'd like to make on organizing, and it's something we learned over time, is that, whatever are the demands of the workers, you actually start with the simplest thing. you don't go for the most difficult one, because building an organization takes a lot of time. It takes trust, because people are working, and the workers we are organizing are workers who are working for long hours. They're women workers who have care responsibilities. They don't have that much time to come together to take actions unless they really, really believe that there will be a change, and they really, really trust the people who are leading that. And that trust and belief only comes about with small victories. So we've always found, start with very small victories. And, a very small victory really inspires people very much. So I think those are the few things I have to say.
Thank you, Renana. Anuradha, would you like to respond?
Yes. So Isabella asked about how you can get women into leadership of unions and what we have done about that. So there are 2 or 3 things we tried. The 2 experiences are very different. We started off working with agricultural workers when we ourselves were not very clear about feminist practices or how to organize. The union was also new. We were also new. We were young, and it was a phase of experimentation. And at that stage, what we found worked very well was organizing women separately as well as along with men. So we formed a separate women's organization and we organized women separately. And I don't think it's possible, at least I'm talking about those days and the way in which India functions, for women to kind of become vocal in a male environment. It's not possible for them. It wasn't, at least at that stage. So women were separate and were separately organized, and we held our discussion separately, and we talked about our issues, our problems separately, and we especially emphasized a lot on domestic violence, issues of gender inequality, wages, all kinds of inequalities that affected women. We talked a lot about that, and gradually women developed the confidence. And I think Renana's, you can make out that she's very much into organizing when she says you have to start with these simple things. That's very true. That's absolutely correct. It was very nice to hear that. And it was very small, simple things that women started off with. And that led to a lot of, kind of confidence building and this kind of, becoming vocal for women. The other thing that we did also along with that was also, talk about gender. Discussion on gender became and still is a kind of a constant in all our training programs. So with men also we talk about gender. And also then the union has very, very strict rules about about domestic violence, about sexual harassment, even about drinking. We're very strict about things like that. So issues that impact women in an adverse way, men have to obey those rules. So this is something also that helped women to come in. And I think the other thing that we have found is that family life, at least in rural Bengal or rural India, family life and work life cannot be separated. The union cannot be just, maybe it's different in the West. I don't think it's a dichotomy that works for women, and I don't think it should be there in the West also. The workplace and family life are very interconnected for women. And it's not possible to organize in your work life if your family life is also not looked after in some way. So, very simple things like what is the time for the meeting? A union would like to have its meetings in the evening, I'm again talking about India. But women are free in the afternoon. They finished cooking their lunch or whatever, feeding their children, and they have 2 or 3 hours left. So times for meetings are very different for men and women, at least in our country. So this is the kind of very small things which led and being sensitive to the way in which women were functioning, which led to this kind of separate this thing of being able to organize women and develop leadership amongst them. And also, as I told you, for the leadership itself, the leadership would be say maybe 15-20 women who led the union. For them, it was necessary to be in a collective, to have childcare, to have housework looked after, to live jointly with other people, so that they were free to work and they were not kind of sort of stuck looking after that. And also the other thing was, of course, sharing of housework. That is something that people in our union, a lot of us are married to each other. We have couples, we've grown up together in the union, and many of us are married. but it's very, very strictly followed that men, there is no stereotyping of roles within the union. So we live and work together. So we cook together also. And many of our men are better cooks than the women. They're much better at that kind of stuff than we are. Huh? So that is one kind of thing. So this is kind of the beginning of our organization and a beginning of our work. In the last 3-4 years, we started working amongst tea workers, tea garden workers. Here, the experience is very different because women workers here are the mainstay of which is not true of, women's work is very important because it doesn't show up so prominently in rural India, in amongst agricultural workers. It's not economically the most important thing. But in the tea industry, if women do not do plucking, the industry will fail. They are the core. It is on their work that the whole industry is built up. It's the pluckers, the women who are the pluckers, who actually, pick the tea leaves, and it's from there that the whole industry starts. If they were not to work, the industry would collapse. So it's very easy talking about women's work there. It could also be the fact that we're more experienced now, but we find there that even men are willing to accept that women are the mainstay of the industry and that women need to come into leadership. It's much more easily acceptable. The other reason why it's easily acceptable is because people are fed up of the unions. They're fed up of the male leadership in their unions. The leadership is extremely corrupt and in various political parties, totally politically biased. So they're fed up of them. So they're looking for alternative leadership. And it seems to them, to even the men, that maybe women are very good leaders there, could provide an alternative. So there are men who are also supportive of this thing of building up women's leadership. We're still in the very preliminary stages of this, but I'm very hopeful that we will be able to do this because also women are much more vocal than they would be in, say, rural Bengal otherwise, because they are already in the workforce and they understand the employer-employee relationship very easily, much more easily than, say, women in agriculture do, because it's the whole work relationship is also very not so stark as it is in the tea industry. So I think, so it's two different experiences, but definitely, this women themselves have to feel that they're important, and that their labor is very, very necessary for the functioning of society. That confidence needs to be built up in women a great deal. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. Isabel, would you like to conclude?
No, maybe we actually have Sarah and Krishna who wanted to
yes, please.
comment. So
Okay.
maybe let's have them too, and then let's see if we can.
Sarah, would you like to intervene at this point?
Okay, thank you very much, Isabel and Neera. Well, just only if I have time, I know the time is running, but I wanted to thank the speakers. Of course, it was very inspiring for me to hear about these organizing stories in India, particularly. I'm speaking from Brussels, the European Trade Union Institute. So I was also thinking all the time about these possible parallels. So Isabel already dropped the question there about the possible parallels with platform workers here in Europe as well, and the story of organizing women in India. And I was thinking more largely about the self-employed and the whole discussion that we are experiencing, at least in Europe, about organizing self-employed, not only in the gig economy, but also beyond. There are a lot of sectors where self-employed is being more and more the rule. And so we have more and more these sort of situations that remind a bit these realities you talk about in India. And I was just interested in knowing whether in your experiences, particularly Renana and Anuradha, whether there was a conflict or how was this organizing wave taken by traditional unions that were there? Because I'm thinking about the situation in Europe is that whenever there is an independent organizing movement, that being the gig economy or elsewhere, or migrants, workers, but in the sort of independent, as an independent way of trade unionism that goes beyond the traditional trade unions in place, then there is a sort of mistrust, of course, and some fear also by traditional trade unions that this could be yellow unions put in place that don't benefit workers, but actually employers. So I was interested in hearing whether this was an issue in India or whether the traditional unions are supporting these actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Krish, shall we take both the questions and then Anuradha and Harsh? Krishna wants to know about your plan for an urban employment scheme. We have to finish in precisely 4 minutes, so sorry, but that's what we're bound by time. They have a book release coming up. Yeah. Harsh?
Do you want us to answer or Harsh? Or? I'll quickly take Sarah's point. Sorry, Raj. Sarah, there was a lot of resistance from the Indian trade unions in the beginning for a long time. In fact, we were part of a bigger trade union. We were thrown out because of all the things we were doing. But that resistance has really crumbled. And now, unions themselves are saying that they're organizing informal workers because in India, there are no other workers to organize. But we work also with the international trade union movement. And we find that the international trade union, especially the European and American trade unions, the European more than the American, are very hostile to the idea of organizing informal workers when it really happens. I mean, in theory, they like it, but when it happens, they are hostile. But they're less hostile than they were 30 years ago. Short answer.
Thank you.
And
Anuradha, would you like to respond?
Harsh should go first. Harsh
Okay.
Anuradha, please.
This time I'll come after. Anyway, Renana's dealt with the issue.
Okay. So, Krishna, an urban NREGA employment guarantee is a very exciting idea. I think we'll have to be very creative. I find one of the biggest challenges there is that urban slums is where we want to, there's huge amounts of work to be done for upgrading urban slums and to create work, but those slums are illegalized. So to create work in illegalized slums is going to be a challenge. And so that's one thing that will have to be dealt with. The other is the care economy. And I feel more and more you have older people without caregivers. There's a whole lot of support that people need to go to hospital, people with disabilities, teaching children with disabilities. So that's the other part. So I think it's a fantastic imagination, but it's a complete reimagination of public provisioning of work guarantees, different from the countryside. We've done a lot of thinking about it. I could have taken much time, but these were some of the issues that came out.
Would you like?
I'll
just take a minute.
Please, Anuradha, please.
So the resistance from traditional unions, from the older unions, is not just along the gender axis. It's not just men and women. It's also the fact that we are organizing amongst sections of the workers who have, been looked down upon by the formal sector for a long time, which I think Renana has already said. So the resistance comes from there also. It's, like they say, "Paya juti mathay utheche." The slipper on your floor is coming on your head. That's the kind of attitude they have towards women and especially informal sector workers. Not just women, also men. So this resistance is there from the traditional trade unions. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Isabel, would you like to wrap up? Or
wrapping up, certainly not wrapping up, but thanking you all for a wonderful panel. We really learned a lot. Thank you so much. We should certainly continue. And we will continue. You know that this is part of a series. And so next month, that's March 22, we will meet again online to look at what's going on in Spain this time, where there is a lot of progress, discussion on democratizing the cooperation which is a specific subfield of democratizing work. We know that there are many, many directions in which this project is going. And certainly, I think it's Anuradha who said that democratizing work is about democratizing society. It's really part of this large project, as large as it is, reviving, nurturing democracy in its really large and thick sense, and saving the planet. So thank you very much for this fantastic workshop, and we'll meet next week. And tonight, as you know, as some of you know, we are actually having the release of our collective volume, Democratize Work, in Dutch. It's been translated in Dutch, and so I'm here in Amsterdam to be with Lisa Herzog, who's a member of the core group, and many members of the Dutch national chapter, Netherlands national chapter, to launch the book in Dutch, and we'll be with the president of the trade union confederation here in the Netherlands, the representative of the workers at the ILO, and some other important people. So that's very heartening. Thank you so much,
everyone. Yes.
Neera.
I may say no. If you look at the compliments that the panelists are giving the, our two speakers and Harsh, it's really very gratifying. Thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I hope this will be a continuous conversation. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Many
Neera.
congratulations for the book in Dutch. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll post the video on the website. So this is going to have a longer life. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Have a
Bye. Good
day.
night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.